Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Vika Bell Robinson, and I am the Director of Residence Life at Miami University. I'm going to be moderating today's webinar on student advocacy, helping students with dissenting behaviors. We'll get our webinar started here in a few minutes, and we're just going to give people a chance to come in from their previous appointments. We'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, we're going to get started with this afternoon's webinar. I'd like to thank you and welcome you to our webinar today. Today's webinar is Student Advocacy, Helping Students with Dissenting Behaviors. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Contemporary Issues Committee. My name is Dr. Vika Bell Robinson, and I am the chair of the GLACUHO Contemporary Issues Committee, and I will be serving as your moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you to maximize your learning for this session. You'll want to leave the GoToWebinar control box at the far right side of your screen open. You'll want to leave that there. This is most likely where you open to join the webinar. To ask questions, type in the chat box, which will remain open for the entire presentation. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but we want to ensure that there's enough time to cover all of the materials. Should you experience any problems, please type in the chat box and I'll work to assist you. At the end of the session, the presentation and audio recording will be available on our website, glacuho.org, under the Webinar Archives resource for future reference. We encourage you to share this resource with your colleagues who were unable to attend. At this time, I will hand it over to our presenter, Stephanie Lynch from Georgetown University, to discuss student advocacy, helping students with dissenting behaviors. Stephanie, you can feel free to begin.
Thank you. Vika and I joked about this earlier that I would have problems unmuting my phone, so I appreciate that. So thank you to Vika. I just wanted to say hello and for all of you for joining me today. And I want to start off by acknowledging that last week was really difficult for a lot of our campuses, our communities, and for individuals, particularly with the rescinding of DACA and also with the questions that are coming up around Title IX and what changes we might see in the next few weeks or months. So first of all, just to give you a little bit of sense of myself, I'm Stephanie Lynch and I serve as the Assistant Dean for Student Affairs, and I oversee the Veterans Office and the Office of Residential Living, which encompasses residential education, housing assignments, operations, summer programs, and conferences. And I'm currently in my 15th year here. My lens today is a white cisgender woman with a master's degree, and I come from an upper middle class background. I grew up in a public school education system. I've lived in 9 different states, both rural and urban, including on a military base, and I currently reside in DC, and I've worked in predominantly private and religious institutions. A little bit more about Georgetown is that we are a predominantly white institution that is both Catholic and Jesuit, and it's the oldest in the country. As I mentioned a minute ago, we're located in Washington, D.C. It's a very active city. I was joking with Vika earlier. We have about 30 protests, I think, or rallies in D.C. this weekend. And in Georgetown in particular, our students do go to a lot of those rallies. They take a lot of student ownership in the community. They run the coffee shop here on campus, the grocery store, storage, the ambulance service on campus, and a credit union. And during my time at Georgetown, I've seen them do a hunger strike. They have chained themselves to the main statue on campus for reproductive rights. We've had 2 sit-ins at the president's office, one for stripping a building name and one for more socially responsible investing. They've advocated against the campus plan and more housing, and they've called for disinviting commencement speakers. They've started a campaign 10 years ago to establish the LGBTQ Center. And we've also worked to develop housing affinity spaces for students who identify as Latinx. And we've also worked with a variety of speakers that student groups have brought to campus. So it's difficult for me to sort of start this conversation without acknowledging Charlottesville, and that most of us were either in training or about to start training when the events of Charlottesville happened. This incident of white supremacy and hate is just one of the many incidents impacting our conversations in our residence halls and influencing our campuses and our residential communities. These are one of the many situations where students are speaking up and are asking us to do the same and expecting our universities to speak out against what they're seeing. I'll also be mindful that college is a formative experience for our students and lots of opportunity for growth. All of us in housing are first and foremost educators, that our spaces may not be the traditional brick and mortar of a classroom or even online classroom, but our residence halls and in the conversations we have with our students and the training and leadership experience we provide for them and for our staffs. Our residence life staff have very intimate relationships in living with students, and we really have an opportunity to make a huge difference. So it's important that we all view working with students and engaging with them on difficult topics, and maybe sometimes not so difficult, but important to them and experiences, is part of our role in housing. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the national landscape and why students are more socially active and engaging in dissenting behaviors. We're going to talk about the foundational role college communities operate under and the tensions that exist in balancing a place that honors all those ideals. We're going to examine institutional culture impacting how administrators work and respond with students, and to implement some strategies as leaders to both build capacity and support each other in our work, to understand that this is a very collaborative effort for all of our campus partners. But I also want to start off being a little upfront and pragmatic with you, that you should plan on another year of campus protest, student activism, and student dissent. And as you can see by this quote, it's what we do, and it's what students do. Student dissent and campus activism is normal. It gives students an opportunity to think about their values, to strategize, to talk with others, to defend a position, and to engage in a civil dialogue and discourse. And it's our responsibility to help students and institutions through that learning. It's messy, it's complicated for both the individuals and the university. It's a good opportunity for learning, and it can also be very divisive to some of our campus community members. Today's student, according to the Cooperative Institutional Research Program, their freshman survey has found that students indicate a greater likelihood of participating in student protests and demonstrations, that students are reportedly stronger commitment to engage in their community, and more students than ever before have indicated becoming a community leader was very important or an essential life objective. Students are generally more well-informed, engaged, and organized than we've ever seen before. According to the Leadership Exchange, students are also increasingly engaged socially and civically. They distrust and are cynical of political systems, and they don't necessarily know which institutions to trust. But I would sort of argue, how could they know? Many systems were set up hundreds of years ago and are seen to systematically oppress communities today. Political parties are saying they don't trust each other, and news is now all fake news. And these are the very foundations of our democracy. Plus, colleges and universities are being targeted by outside groups to push their ideology. And so we have to help students understand and be prepared for being an engaged citizen, and that means dissent and engaging in dialogue and working with each other. So I'm going to take a minute now to show you a video that Bethany Tognacci, who's a member of our staff, she made this video about 6 months ago. And while many of the incidents and issues encountered are present and continue to resonate, I also want to acknowledge that white supremacy post-Charlottesville, DACA, the Title IX Dear Colleague letter changes we're anticipating, and the transgender ban for newly enrolled military service members are not present. But what I appreciate about this particular video is it really speaks to the emotions that we're talking about when we're also talking about this from an intellectual space.
Fox News alert: massive protests and rioting have erupted at the University of California at Berkeley. Demonstrators have forced the cancellation of a speech by Breitbart News' Milo Yiannopoulos. Demonstrators have set fires, they burned vehicles, they launched fireworks at the building, threw rocks, trying to breach the doors.
Emma Solkowitz has vowed to carry a dorm room mattress with her everywhere on campus until her rapist is expelled or leaves campus on his own.
Temple University will offer gender-inclusive housing beginning in August 2017. This means that students can share a suite or apartment on campus with other students regardless of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, or sexual orientation.
So why I wanted to show you that video is that our institutions exist in a social context with differential access to education and income, health, safety, dignity, opportunities, racial disparity, religious intolerance, and quality of life. And that students in particular are often expressing their behaviors within privilege and identity. As Father Massingale wrote, quote, "The road to a just society must go through the path of social conflict." End quote. And students are often the group that is helping to drive social change at a national level. So how do we help students? And I would say that first it starts with recognizing many of the current issues present in our society, and that helps to ground our work in education and as educators, and that knowing how our institution navigates and engages students on these challenging topics that are deeply personal and can sometimes hit to someone's core. So as you've seen, the executive orders, the Supreme Court decisions, and the judicial stays impact what laws are both passed and enacted. There have been an increase in legislation targeted at the LGBT community. The bathroom bills in North Carolina have resulted in millions of dollars in losses to the state when that was going on some time ago. There are also campus carry laws, mental health laws in VA post Virginia Tech, and there are also changes around finances and how graduate students are seen and paid on campuses. I would also say that being present with students and understanding what they're going through can also give you a sense of what their fears are and can help you develop relationships with students. Right now, and you may have seen that on our campus here, we've had incidents of swastikas over the last week, and so really engaging with our campus community and understanding how we can be helpful and provide a more supportive climate as well. We also have global issues that impact our campus climate around financial, the refugee crisis, there's political acts of terrorism. I can say from our standpoint, this summer we had a conference group that actually canceled because of the federal legislation that was happening at the time we were trying to secure the contract. Then I would also say that understanding what I'm talking about in terms of students, also thinking about and framing not only from an undergraduate perspective, but also from a graduate perspective, that we have many non-traditional students. You may have married students or students with dependents that are living on campus, and they may have a whole different set of concerns. As I mentioned earlier, I work with the Veterans Office, and the veterans and the military-connected community, at least on our campus, really talking about accessing benefits so they can maximize the Yellow Ribbon program, access for families at the recreational center and our student health clinic, more staffing and staff for the office in general. On our campus, when we talk about graduate students, we often talk about graduate student space, childcare, transportation, club and organizational support, case management, and also just being treated with a similar set of appreciation for our undergraduate student community here on the Hilltop. In terms of subscribing to national organizations, I would say there's a wide variety of national organizations, including the Student Conduct Association, ACUHOI, NASPA, ACPA, JASPA, which is the Jesuit Association for Student Personnel, the American Council of Education, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and there's also daily updates with the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, and the ACUHA online community that can give you an overview of the landscape, best practices, and one piece that I've really appreciated are the different policy statements that are coming out on emerging issues. The GW and RA unionization case last spring is a good example. I'd also think about what campus presidential announcements you're seeing on your campus, because that can indicate what's important to you and to the university's position in particular. We've had a lot of different conversations come out about DACA last week. We have staff that work in federal relations that have been doing a lot of lobbying efforts and sending letters up to Capitol Hill along with working with many of our students. I would also say that colleagues can tell you a lot about what's going on. At least in our area in DC, you may see this either at a state level or a more local level as well, that we just talk to other colleagues that are at other campuses. American University is about 5 minutes up the road. GW is a short walk away. And you know, figuring out what they've seen. American had some racial issues this last spring. and GW had the RA case that I mentioned earlier. And so just thinking about what that looks like and the impact, because many of our students are friends or are connected through more city affiliations. And lastly, I would add social media, and checking in on that can give you a good sense of the news of the day, and also response and reactions from various points of view. But the current issues are just one piece of the puzzle, and to understand the campus environment and the tensions and guideposts for institutions, add another layer that can help you in navigating your environment. So as I show a picture of Vica's institution, Miami, Ohio, I also want to say that I'm mindful of Ernest Boyer's 1990 work, Campus Life in Search of Community, where he lays out 6 principles of campus communities as a foundation for the work that we do and what we're trying to accomplish. To think about us as a purposeful community, place where faculty and students share academic goals and that they work together to strengthen teaching, that we're an open space, so this idea of freedom of expression being uncompromisingly protected and civility powerfully affirmed, and a just space where there's sacredness of the person that is honored and where diversity is aggressively pursued. As I flip over to talk about the other 3 and Denison University, I will say a disciplined community, a place where individuals accept their obligations to the group, and where a well-defined governance procedure guides behaviors of the common good. A caring place where individuals of each member is sensitively supported and where service is encouraged. And also a celebrative community where the heritage of the institution is remembered and where rituals are affirming both tradition and change are also widely shared. And so probably as I was going through these quickly, what you've heard, maybe you've heard and hopefully heard some of the inherent tensions that exist in a campus community when you're talking about what it means to be part of a university community. So we talk about it here at Georgetown as sort of the creative tensions that are defined as competing values where there's not necessarily can be resolved by choosing one or the other. It's not that one's a positive and one's a negative or an extreme, but they're necessary mechanisms for growth, and there's process within an organization to really talk about the difference between and to understand that there's complexity between these creative tensions. So my VP, who is Dr. Todd Olson, he's the Vice President for Student Affairs, he's outlined 6 creative tensions in student affairs work that I think are really helpful when we're talking about working with students, engaging our campus response, that I think is really helpful, and we even talk about it in some of our space earlier this morning at our directors meeting. So the first one is to think about free expression and a respectful and inclusive community. And one thing to really consider are what are the boundaries of unpopular ideas and freedom of expression. That as higher education, we're founded on this idea as a place of learning and gaining critical thinking skills, and that there is a difference between unpopular and distasteful ideas and what would be threatening, unsafe, and discriminatory practices. And if you're working in a public institution, you're bound by the First Amendment, and many private institutions also pay deference to the First Amendment as well. And so part of it is thinking about how do you powerfully affirm and welcome students and at the same time provide those welcoming spaces to the broader community, but allowing people to freely express their ideas. The second part about the individual versus the overall community, individuals are going to engage in behavior and conversations that are offensive and disruptive. And how do we explore ideas and uphold the right for individuals to have differing opinions while also setting up mechanisms in advance to respond to students that are feeling unsafe or affirm the ideas of community that we are both just and caring at the same time while providing the rights of the individuals. When we're thinking about tradition versus change, we've seen this, celebrating the history of an institution and change can be complex. And that recently we've seen this particular tension play out with the Confederate flag, statues and buildings named for KKK members, and others that held enslaved persons. And how do we also recognize that our society and our students of today are not the same students who came to campus and that 10, 20, and 50 years ago, and that our approaches over time need to change and change within our environment and the students that come to our campus and our values as an institution. So, we've seen some changes just in our housing policy around, what does it look like? And these are very sort of more basic examples, but like curfew and alcohol and comfort animals. Well, not exactly tradition versus change. It does think about, how we've changed some of our processes over time, and yet we still get questions about curfew every year. So in terms of the fidelity to mission and fidelity to the university, this one for me in particular speaks probably a little bit more to a religious institution than perhaps a public institution, but you may still see some comparisons. That, for a religious institution, we're required to host and moderate this open dialogue and a vigorous debate as a university. And sometimes we can make religious officials a bit anxious that we're not necessarily living up to our mission. We talk about that in our space being both authentically Catholic and authentically a university. And if you're interested in learning more, several years ago, the president of Notre Dame had written a really good article that talks about the tension that exists there. We also struggle to maintain a vibrant identity for students that sometimes don't see themselves as Catholic. And at the same time, though, we have brought, or student organizations have brought, for example, Cecile Richards, who's the president of Planned Parenthood, came to Georgetown. And I will say that we do spend a lot of time talking about condoms and condom distribution. And we have student groups that distribute condoms but are not recognized by the institution. And so this has been an ongoing topic of dialogue and debate over the last several years. About the thoughtful, inclusive process in making nimble and responsive decisions for Georgetown, and you're going to hear a lot more about this in November at the conference, we engaged in a process of slavery memory and reconciliation starting in about 2015, and we quickly removed building names after a student protest in the president's office. And finally, in thinking about creative tensions, listening and responding to students and focusing on our institutional priorities, the question about how do you engage your students and make decisions that talk about what's important to you. An example here at Georgetown is that we don't recognize a Greek system, and yet 10% of our students belong to Greek organizations. And we've time and time again affirmed it's contrary to our mission and our priorities as an institution. And so how a college and university navigates these tensions can often be found in the culture of the institution itself. So I will say that each institution has a unique culture, and how campuses approach, support, or don't approach students and student dissent depends on your institutional culture. So the culture of Xavier, shown here, also a Jesuit and Catholic institution, located in Ohio, though, it's different than Georgetown. And at the same time, if you look at Xavier, it's different than Indiana State University, a state institution with over 13,000 students, which can also look different than Eastern Illinois University, that was founded as a teacher's college and has been going through a horrific state budget crisis over the last several years, along with other institutions in Illinois. So I've outlined a few ideas around institutional culture that are helpful to understand. As Father Massengale had said, quote, institutions, because of their instincts for self-preservation, are inherently adverse to conflict and risk, end quote. I personally see that institutions are very complex entities, and that it's important to understand how the various aspects of the culture impact your approach in working with students and your institution's approach. So there are state laws and state financing that indicate priorities and messages. You might have seen that the UC system is suing the federal government over DACA being rescinded. University of Tennessee Diversity Office is no longer funded by state funds. And in DC, we've also pushed the minimum wage up. And so we have increases in our budgets related to compensation because of those changes. I would also acknowledge that there's internal work to be done at a university level. We tend to buy into the narrative that higher education is a liberal space. But I would certainly say look at your institution's senior leadership, and does it include women, staff and faculty of color, trans-inclusive policies, and equal pay? And then I also want to mention that there are informal and formal structures on campus and relationships that play a role in these power dynamics. Trust me, on a campus with limited parking here in DC, transportation staff have lots of informal power on this campus. In terms of institutional governance, I will say that oftentimes you can have very loosely coupled systems, nebulous and multiple goals, decentralized environments, and entrenched historical memory, and especially for staff who haven't been here long or are new or may not stay long enough, they may not see a lot of the changes that you may see over time. In terms of finances, with very few exceptions, I would say that we're all resource-dependent institutions and that we need to find money, and that budget is a reflection of our priorities. And so we basically give money to what we value. From a legal aspect, many of these laws around FERPA, ADA, fair housing, and many of the anti-discrimination and harassment, they all provide protections, and it's really balancing our legal obligations with our ethos of care. For example, how a school approaches FERPA in practice might be different, such as parental contact, for example. One thing I do want to mention is this idea of academic freedom, and that faculty have academic freedom, and any of us on a staff perspective do not. And that's a very important distinction. And that there are times that students and faculty will either question, perhaps be upset that we're not doing more, or that we don't necessarily speak out, but we don't have the same protections. And that being an employee and using social media and advocating on campus can sometimes be a tricky space. And I can't give you a firm answer, except that you have to guide yourself and look to your institution for guideposts. And I understand that many of us want to speak up and speak out, but we also have seen that some institutions have dismissed employees for statements and posts, and I can't speak for what one institution may or may not do. With regards to reputational risk, I would say what your university's reputation and what they continue to promote and foster is the reputation of that institution, and that schools do not want to be on the front page. Think about Baylor and the campus climate issues around sexual assault, or Mizzou and the fallout with the decreased enrollment and the closed residence halls from 2015. And finally, in terms of values and mission, to really consider what is the university's why, what is the core of what it does. For example, I have friends that work at the University of Texas, El Paso, and their mission is founded in access to higher education. They're very concerned about costs. They also serve the larger Juarez, El Paso community and provide in-state tuition to students from Mexico. And the majority of students are first gen and understand, for students in particular, their culture at the institution also means that they reach out a lot to families and the El Paso area as well. So as I show this picture of Michigan State, I will tell you that no, I am not from Michigan State, but I was on campus this summer, and so I had to throw in this particular picture. And so as I mentioned earlier, each university has a culture, and J. Michael Denton had mentioned in his work in Contested Issues in Student Affairs that was entitled Using Cultural Theory to Inform Student Affairs Practice, quote, how we communicate, what we communicate about, and what we omit in communication reveal our cultural understanding and values while simultaneously creating them, end quote. And so what I'm going to show you next are some of the documents and policies part of the culture, and it's important when you're working with students to understand those policies and also, more importantly, how they're lived out. So here are a few helpful ones that I thought I would share with all of you, and that staff who've been around for a while should be mindful to help newer members of your team to understand the written and unwritten policies. One of the examples I can share is during the elections, Bernie Sanders was coming to campus as a presidential candidate. And one of my staff members asked, they said, well, we'll never invite, and you could insert another candidate if you'd like, due to their views. And we said, well, it's our policy that during elections, we have a long-standing tradition of inviting all presidential candidates, and they have the choice to accept or not accept. I would also suggest using or crafting a few case studies to see how members of the staff would respond. At American University this spring, there were incidents of students using sticky notes to write F, and not just F, Trump, on their residence hall windows. And that faculty bringing their children through and prospective students and their families saw these notes and were concerned, and also saying, well, is this a safe space for more conservative students? And the housing staff determined it was free speech and advocated for the sticky notes to remain. And I will say that as I say that example, we had that exact same example on our campus last week. And I also acknowledge that many institutions are now struggling with the question of what to do if a Confederate flag shows up on campus. As Jonathan Pollard wrote in his work in Contested Issues in Student Affairs regarding relationship between policy and student norms, Jonathan had commented that policies can only go so far in addressing and challenging student beliefs and values and attitudes, and as practitioners, we should not rely on them solely to produce the learning environments they desire. And Jonathan went on to say we must recognize the limitations of policies alone in managing student norms and engagement by simultaneously drafting mentally appropriate programs that produce students with tools and skills for engaging in open and respectful dialogue. We also have a policy on campus that when there are speakers, they're required to take questions from the audience. Several years ago, we had a student group called the Lecture Fund that invited the founder of the Minuteman Project, which I would say that they are considered a militia group that is, in their purposes, thinking of border security. Students on the Justice and Diversity and Action Living and Learning community were particularly concerned about this person coming to campus, and that the faculty and the hall staff worked with the students. They wore matching shirts to the event, and that each student got up and asked really difficult and thoughtful questions while other students were outside protesting the event. And that the overall approach and recommendation I have seen time and time again is that the idea of more speech, not less speech, helps. That more conversation and dialogue, not less. And then I'll give our Student Engagement Office a lot of credit for continuing to work with students on very difficult topics. As when Cecile Richards came to campus, we had a Palestinian student group that had brought a national conference here and had worked with our Jewish Student Association. And we also make a policy that we don't disinvite controversial speakers or commencement speakers. We have Jay Johnson from the Department of Homeland Security last year that was a commencement speaker, and he worked with our School of Foreign Service to meet with students that were impacted by many of the policies and procedures from his particular office. Within residence living, we involve students with regards to housing and residence life policies, and construction and renovation projects have at least 2 or 3 students on every one of our construction meetings, starting from the design phase and just thinking about what we might be doing. We've had ongoing and consistent engagement with our student government and our RHA through our campus plan group and with senior leaders. During our residential master planning process, we worked with our student government, our Residence Hall Association. We hosted open forums. We had them as members of the committee, and we conducted assessments and focus groups with students. And I will say that our ongoing engagement has paid off. Our relationships are less contentious. We're able to share our perspectives and gain a better appreciation for each other's point of view. And I will say that a student did comment to me recently when I was mentioning that I was talking with all of you, and he really reflected about the fact that he really appreciates being able to engage in conversations and be able to express an opinion with administrators, because it gave him the skills when he was working at an internship this summer to be able to speak up in meetings where he saw that many of his fellow interns didn't feel as comfortable to do the same. So as you see a picture of our staff, and here's a little bit of Georgetown for you, I'm going to take you on a much more individual level regarding leadership and working with students and staff as a leader and your leadership style. And in the book, Identity and Leadership by Alicia Fedolina Chavez and Ronnie Sanlow, they really talk about an approach about the ways of being and the ways of doing that are inherent in leadership pertaining to social justice. But I will say that I did find it very insightful in being a leader and supporting our students as they navigate and creating their stories. And so I wanted to share these pieces with you, and that they discuss the ways of being are characteristics and qualities that leaders cultivate through experiences and internal work and ongoing learning, while the ways of doing are strategies and practices and how to change and support environments for institution and personal growth. And that these first few, the first few that I'm going to show with you are the ways of being, and to really thinking about strength and perseverance and hope I personally see myself as an internal optimist, and I believe that like stones, we create ripples when you throw them in the water, and that if you give good, good will eventually come back and spread. Now we have to give our students and our staff a sense of hope that change will happen over time. Maybe not while they're here, but it will happen. I also think it's important for you to understand and take time to think about why you do your work and what centers you as a person, and that how you view the world and maybe how that might help or hurt your leadership style when you're engaging with others. I would also say that having people tell their stories and understand their complex identities and witnessing oppression can drive people into action and change perspectives. That I can certainly say that over time my perspective and approaches have changed. I would also challenge everybody to say, well, if we don't listen, then how can we help? And how can we be advocates and supportive administrators? And I can't help them understand that change that they want and help them appropriately advocate for themselves and for others if I don't understand. And then I also know that I have to use my privilege as a white cisgender woman and my role at the institution to benefit others. And that I also have to understand and figure out how staff from marginal identities experience and are impacted by the campus climate, what's happening at a local and national level, and where can I be helpful. In terms of the sense of responsibility that comes with being a leader, we have an obligation to make our campuses more welcoming for all of our students and for our staff, and that we have roles to play, particularly as we move up at our institutions, as we have somewhat of a track record, and as we gain power and influence. And I get that it's exhausting in this current climate to be continually out there, but we all owe it to our students and our staff, because otherwise we're not making this space a more inclusive and welcoming space for everyone. And that one of the things that I was thinking about and reflecting on, and this came up during our training in August for our staff and has continued to come up over the last several weeks, is staff are really struggling to find a connection and support somebody that they fundamentally disagree with. I have friends who say the same thing that work in education. And one of our faculty in residence had recently offered the idea of finding a way from maybe more of a clinical perspective, and it may or may not work for you, but to find something that you can make a connection with the person with, and it might just be something very, very simple, but to try and figure out a way to reach out to them. I also have a friend who isn't a glucopreachant, as a matter of fact, who stresses going to 5 lunches or 5 coffees with people who share a different viewpoint, just to go out, gain relationships, and to gain perspectives. And when in uncertain times, it's critically important to both grow and do self-work. I have certainly experienced discomfort and growth and made mistakes, and it doesn't feel great knowing your impact on someone regardless of your intent, but you have to be open to hearing that feedback as well. Plus, you will have to face that if you stand up and advocate, you will experience sometimes some negative reactions, and that both are critically important to being a leader in these particular times. That we have to continually advocate for a diverse staff, to provide and gain insight and perspective, and to be a curious learner. I owe it to say that if we immediately put down another in a very disparaging way, we lose the opportunity for dialogue and growth for both of us. And if we're going to have any hope in dialing down the vitriol, we all have to stop smashing viewpoints and attacking people. And that goes beyond my dinner table at the family holidays. I would also say that I can struggle with being a vulnerable leader, and it's important to role model that, to name our sadness, our impacts, our personal stories, as it cultivates this idea of empathy, and that I believe there is potential that we will leave this world a better place than what we found it, and that's one of the reasons why I personally got into higher education. I believe that there is a public good served in higher education that is in informed, engaged citizens, and that we don't necessarily have to agree, but we have to figure out how to listen, to critically think, to examine our views, and come from a place of respect and good intentions to reach a common good. And I understand that not everybody does that, and that can sometimes be difficult to then take that approach. As for the doing, I would say, going quickly, there are 7 concepts. This idea of daily acts of working with our students and our staff. To acknowledge that there's this ongoing commitment and you need to show love and support being with and for each other. And that much of the work that we do with students happens at a very local level on a very daily basis. Administrators are on campuses longer than most students will be, and that we can use our networks and our resources for education, self-care, and collaboration for all. And that we should teach and practice perseverance and resiliency, as there will be challenges. There will be setbacks, but collaboration and persistence will help students realize the change they seek. And it's also important to talk to them about the boundaries and what's not realistic. And that sometimes you have to hold firm and say no. Sometimes you give them advice on a different approach when they seem to be heading down the wrong road. And sometimes you can help dismantle a roadblock or educate colleagues and offer a new perspective. To consider how and where decisions are made, to educate yourself on the process, and we've talked a little bit about that earlier, and to consider those legislative impacts. We also need to recognize that everyone has unique abilities and we need a diverse leadership. And our job as leaders is to understand our staff and harness their potential, their talents and their skills and their areas of passion, so perhaps they can fill in your blind sides, your area for growth, or maybe reach students that you just don't want to or feel comfortable reaching. I would say learn to speak truth to power and to ourselves, to remind people of our university's why and its mission. I say respectful, as most of the time you need a job and a career, and that students are in their developmental phases understanding how to advocate for themselves and think critically and to test new ways of thinking. But where you are is that you're not a college student probably at your institution. We should be using our resources to bring different people of different backgrounds together, and that the university experience is often the first time people from different backgrounds will interact with each other. And that we are really the connectors that bridge people to have a better appreciation for the other. And it doesn't always have to start big. It can start with very small ways so that there's exposure and growth, and so people are seen as multidimensional. And to challenge yourself to consider what policies need to be modified and changed to create a more inclusive environment. Thinking about living and learning communities or new centers, gender inclusive housing policies, maybe a food pantry, winter break housing for students who can't go home or maybe don't want to go home. And how do you engage students in that conversation and making sure that it represents a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences? And to think about where and how you can stand up for others when they're feeling defeated, and that you have to support each other, and that it's not up to the LGBTQ identified staff to support and advocate with and for LGBTQ students alone. It's for allies and it's for all of us. When working with students and staff, I would also say to name who's in the room and who isn't. And where do you role model for your students and staff around confronting behaviors and working with others? And as I get older, I have found more and more female identified staff members reaching out to me for advice, and I'm mindful of the commitment to be a better colleague and a better friend and role model to all of them. And in the end, I think of this as being a champion for what is right, for wanting to make the institution a more welcoming and inclusive place for all. So I would say, as I sort of get towards the end of my remarks, that you decided to participate in this webinar for a reason. Working with students in dissenting behaviors is more than having a conversation with them. And to challenge each of you to make one commitment over the next month that will help in terms of supporting students. And then I will also say that you might choose depending on your level of agency at your particular institution. So some of that might look at training and supporting staff, and to spend time talking with students and staff around current issues and trends, perhaps the student experience from a variety of lenses, thinking about how you could bring in campus partners from maybe both the faculty and staff side. Are there campus or trainings events that you could go to or within your local community, or are there national organizations that you could take the opportunity to go and be a part of that process? I would also say that our staff in particular took the initiative this past May to host an Inclusive Community Summit for the DC area, and so that was really helpful for them, and I think it also gave new training opportunities for all of us in this area. I would also say we could take time out to be with and for each other a little bit as well. That there have been a lot of major incidents happening over the last several weeks, and at least on our campus, we try to send out a note to our professional staff and provide opportunities to connect one-on-one or as a group. We've hosted lunches. We sent out something to all of our students this last weekend. And I've also seen and also participated in checking in with individuals that I know have been impacted. I would also say thinking about your policies, like how do you respond to incidents on your campus? What do you need to clarify or affirm? You know, what do you think about when you implement conduct sanctions? Do you think about learning? Are they fine-based? Are they restorative justice? And what's the balance of the tensions we discussed earlier in terms of the individual and the community? You know, use data and use benchmarking to suggest changes as well. With regards, to community development, to set up opportunities for students to engage with each other, to bring faculty and partner offices in to discuss issues with civil discourse. We have a faculty in residence that does Woke Wednesdays, which allows different voices to speak, and it's been a really great opportunity to engage in ongoing dialogue. You know, are there spaces where you could create affinity spaces in your residence halls and do programming with mission in mind? And that you as leaders have a responsibility to work and support students to help them make connections and develop the campus through student ownership and empowerment. Let them struggle with some of these questions and you can help them and advise them through that process. I would also say get out there more broadly on campus and participate in programs or forums or long-standing committees, because that really helps you understand and develop strong relationships with partner offices. And you can go teach, and that gives you a sense of what is also happening at a broader level. You know, some of the conversations I've had with my faculty partners in terms of what they're facing in the classroom is eye-opening when I think about what's happening in the residence halls. So there's leadership opportunities for students, help them navigate the climates. It does mean asking them tough questions and sometimes saying no, and sometimes it means advocating and supporting and push them and push the processes in the campus climates, and that they will not always be happy with you, as we talked about earlier. And finally, I would say practicing self-work and self-care, doing the difficult work on examining your own identity and privilege and how it can help you in being a better leader for our students and our professional staff, and to role model what we hope to undertake, and to know that this is a long journey and that we need to take time out to recharge ourselves. This is just the start of the academic year, and this can be exhausting, and that we all need to be there for each other as we go through some difficult times. So with all that, I know we have a few minutes left to see if there's any particular questions or thoughts or comments that we might want to engage in.
Are there any questions? I don't have any questions right now in the chat box or in the question box, but Stephanie, I do have a question that I'll pose on behalf of the group that's listening.
Okay.
How do you help students learn to advocate for themselves?
That's a good question. So I would say, and perhaps acknowledge, that sometimes they may not necessarily know that they're trying to figure out that they're trying to advocate for themselves. And it can sometimes be a little bit messy as they're starting out. So one example I can share is we had a student last year who had come into our housing office and was very upset with their housing assignment. And there had been some changes in that person's housing assignment. And initially our staff member had given what was a very standard response. It was appropriate, professional, and as we started digging into the situation and another staff member was working with the student, what we found out through that process is that the student had had very uncertain family home life situations and had been at times living in shelter, sounds like at times had been homeless, and so that person was really taking the first step in trying to advocate for themselves because of feeling uncertain. So from the staff's perspective, part of it was acknowledging what that person was feeling and going through, and as that information became available, also having the awareness on our end to say, okay, now I can understand what's going on a little bit better. So can I assure this student, and I need to assure this student, you will always have a home here. You will never go without a space. And for this particular student, as they were reflecting, said, I really appreciate you helping me through this process because it's really the first time I've had to advocate for myself. in this type of space. So some of it is just being very patient, being sensitive and understanding, and trying to ask good questions that will help you understand what might be some of the bigger issues that they're not necessarily talking to you about, but are impacting their decisions and how they're approaching you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I do have a few more. Let's see. Without a written statement, what is the best approach for understanding how far you can speak out on your campus and not see repercussions for your employment?
That is, so I will say that that's a tricky question, and that's actually one we're sort of struggling with a little bit here. We don't have a written policy. I also know that there are some staff members who, over the years, have put more controversial pieces on their social media posts, and others who have chosen not to. I can say from my personal perspective and from some other offices that I work with, you know, sometimes people will have 2 different social media accounts. There are times, because of my particular role in overseeing the Veterans Office and understanding that we have to support whoever is in office, and I've been here for Bush and Obama and Trump, and so maybe not support, but I don't always come out as strongly as I might on certain issues because I'm also navigating my particular role that I have at the institution. And I can also say that there are times where I have taken more of an assertive stance on some things. What we have sort of generally said, and I say this somewhat cautiously because we haven't seen it go into practice yet, is we have a certain sense of freedom in terms of our personal social media accounts. And I think that's different if you're talking about your staff accounts or your building accounts or your university accounts. Where it gets a little trickier and where we have seen people from other institutions either come under severe criticism or perhaps dismissed is when they have seen, or it's been seen as harassing the other people at the institution or making the place safe and unwelcoming to other communities. Hope that helped answer some of that question. So I know we're getting close to the end of time. Are there any last minute questions or anything else that I might be able to help answer today? Okay. Well, when this is shared with you, there are some questions at the end to consider or engage in, maybe with your friends and colleagues, but just thinking about being your authentic self in the workplace, to continue to think about the role of politics and what does supporting students on your own campus look like, and thinking about some of the practices, thinking about some of those tensions that we talked about earlier today. So I guess with that, Vika, I'll turn it back over to you. So I'm just trying to see if there are any other questions that are out there before we wrap up for the end of the day. Okay, I guess with that then, if there aren't any other questions, we'll wrap up. And I really appreciate everybody's time. I know it's a very busy time of year and that there's lots going on. I hope this is a helpful discussion. And if any of you are going to be at Wakuho in November, I'm more than happy to engage in a conversation one-on-one, or just sit over a meal or coffee and just to get a chance to meet all of you in person. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate your patience and the questions that we were able to have at the end as well.